Hi. So, what we're going to do now is discuss how media have become involved in historical accounts of political power and historical change. And we're going to be explaining why the work of James Curran is so important in understanding how media come to be seen as cultural drivers of historical change. So, I would direct your attention to the introduction to James Currans' work on media and power. So he has this book here, which he's written about it. And the first chapter outlines how media and power operates through a certain telling of British history. And I suppose one of the reasons why I'm setting this as a key reading is although it's very closely tied to British history and a British context, one of the things that we have to do as media scholars is we have to learn to take regionally specific writings and try and extrapolate and try and think about how those ideas are relevant to other times. So what we're doing is we're not trying to come to grips with the detailed historical facts and figures that Curran is talking about. And really, we're trying to discern a larger narrative of what he's trying to say about the relationships between media and political history. Because it's through this that we begin to understand how media representation comes to be related to questions of political power. And indeed, when we see things from that perspective, we learn to see very quickly that these sorts of ideas are still very much germane to contemporary media environments. So, James Curran suggests that if you look at history proper, there is a certain argument that all history is political history. History is really about the conflicts between different groups and different ideas and how those conflicts produce the world that exists today. And Curran argues that histories are very often can be crudely divided into stories of liberation versus stories of oppression. And we can very quickly see how the media become central to each one of those narratives. So, if we begin with the first idea, the idea that history is the story of liberation, and in this regard, Curran talks about the way that different fields, so studies of liberal democracy, studies of feminism, these sorts of things, studies of ordinary people, view history as a story of how ordinary people gradually throw off the shackles of their own oppression. Now, I've got here a still from Les Miserables, which always cheers me up because I think it's a hilarious film just because it's so funny because people sing all the time. It's like, I'm Russell Crowe. Why do they do that? Anyway, sorry, I digress. But of course, it's set during the Paris Commune of 1848, which is seen as a key moment in European history, where Marxist thinking, theories of capitalist oppression, become working factors that help throw off the shackles around working people. And so this is a popular representation of this liberatory view of history. And Curran talks about other kinds of views of history, for example, feminist histories, which talk about the way that women gradually learn to claim and occupy positions of relative equality in society, or certainly positions that are less unequal than they used to be in the past. And that's a controversial argument, and we're going to pick that up later on. But nevertheless, we see ways that history, for some people, is a story about how the world became more civilized and how the world became more civilized through ordinary people learning to throw off the shackles of their oppression. Now, the point that Curran makes is there's a very close parallel between those sorts of histories and certain kinds of histories of media as well as regards power. So Curran notes that media industries, and here he's talking about everything from the popular press through to radio, television, cinema, and even up to the present digital moment, are seen as enjoying a parallel history. What he argues is that if you look at certain histories of the media in the United Kingdom, what you see is a story of how media gradually win their freedom from state oppression. So, for example, he starts off with talking about the radical press and talks about the way that the 19th century radical press, which was a voice for the common working people, was significantly impeded in its early days by draconian legislation, particularly taxation, which meant that only wealthy people could afford to run newspapers. And gradually, those bonds are freed. The barriers to entry to media industries are made more accessible. More importantly, media industries are freed from state regulation. And also, as we move into the age of radio and television, more space is made for popular culture, and popular culture is seen as something which really gives an authentic democratic voice to ordinary people. A common theme in 20th century history has been a growing interest in the lives of ordinary people, how ordinary people think, how they live, what they like, what they do. And Curran argues that if we look at contemporary phenomenon here I've got a still from the UK reality show Britain's Got Talent, and this is a still of last year's winner. Forget the guy's name, but he was a war veteran. I believe he was almost 80 years old, a Korean war veteran who won. And this was seen as a great blow for popular democracy. You know, the idea that you can win these sorts of shows, you know, even if you're not a young, good-looking member of a boy or girl band. So this was seen as breaking down important barriers around notions of age and social importance of these sorts of things. Now, we may dismiss these kinds of shows as being kind of low culture and not being very interesting and being very generic. But I think what Curran would say is they actually are an important part of media history and the way that popular entertainment, and I mean popular entertainment, things that people watched in their masses and things that they enjoyed, because people do enjoy these shows, and that's true. And that historically, these were seen as being important things which actually gave ordinary people, particularly working class people, a certain visibility in culture that they hadn't enjoyed before. So when we're talking about the relationship between media and political freedom, media and political history, media and democratization, the point that Curran makes is that as television and radio come along and film, we begin to see the way that entertainment also becomes a forum for political communication. So there are these certain historical narratives about the gradual emergence of democracy, and what Curran argues is that the operation of media industries are seen as drivers of that trend. Now, of course, the other point that Curran makes is that that's obviously a contestable history. 2 points. Firstly, we have the idea that the historians argue amongst themselves about the notion that history is a story of progress, and that idea has been very much attacked in throughout the 20th century. The idea that history is a story of how the world became more civilized. Well, empirically speaking, that's not true anymore. And we can think about this from our own experience. If we sit down and we talk to our children, can we really tell our children that they're going to inherit a better world? There's lots of evidence around to suggest that we're not going to be able to do that. And this is the sort of existential crisis that historians quite often talk about, the idea that we can't actually tell a story where the world is becoming more civilized, more democratic, and a better place. And of course, that has a relationship to media as well. So, on the one hand, there are narratives which talk about how media become relatively autonomous from the state, become relatively accessible to ordinary people, and become voices for democracy, become voices where different visions of social reality become present. But there are also those who'd argue that the replacing of clear formal forms of state regulation and state oppression on the press have been replaced by more effective yet more nuanced forms of control. So here we have Jeff Bezos, as a representation of the idea that we now live in a world where any form of public expression quite often runs through media industries that are effectively controlled by a very, very small number of people. So there's also the argument that the story of media is the story of the centralization of power, particularly in relation to private enterprise and the market. So the point of all of this is simply to say that James Curran relates media to power by showing how the operation of media industries can be closely connected to the way that democratic development has been imagined through history. And there are a range of questions that we might ask about that. So the question of, is the world becoming more democratic or less democratic, is something which has really driven the historians, and is increasingly something which we can't really discuss without a knowledge of how media industries work. And that's how media are related to the question of power. But of course, I guess one of the big questions is we can all see that, right? We all know this is happening. So if we can all see these dynamics at work, if we can label them, if we can talk about them, how come they still work? And the answer to that lies in the next topic we're going to talk about, which is the theme of ideology.